In the spring of 1980, wrecking crews moved into a mansion in suburban Philadelphia. The building they were about to demolish was larger than the White House. It had cost over $10 million to build in 1921. It contained 147 rooms across 100,000 square feet. The crews wore t-shirts that said Stotesbury Mansion on the back, a souvenir of destruction. Whitemarsh Hall was the third largest private residence ever built in the United States. Only Biltmore in North Carolina and Oheka Castle on Long Island exceeded it in size. When French Premier Georges Clemenceau visited in the 1920s, he called it America's answer to the Palace of Versailles. 59 years after completion, it was reduced to rubble in a matter of weeks. The demolition of Whitemarsh Hall remains the largest deliberate destruction of a private residence in American history. Not damaged by fire, not condemned as unsafe, simply too expensive to maintain and impossible to sell. A monument to an era that built palaces without considering whether anyone would want to preserve them. The story of Whitemarsh Hall is not just about architecture. It is about a banker who rose from clerk to partner of J.P. Morgan. About a widow who married wealth and built an empire of social dominance. About 5 years of construction that created something extraordinary. And about how quickly extraordinary things can become worthless when the money stops. Today, 4 massive limestone columns stand in a suburban development called Stotesbury Estates. Townhouses surround them. Children play near foundations that once supported ballrooms. The columns are all that remain of a world that believed its wealth would last forever. If you enjoy my videos, please like and subscribe. I also appreciate it if you consider supporting the channel by becoming an exclusive ODM supporter. Now, this is the story of how that world was built, and why it could not survive. The janitor who became Morgan's richest man. Edward Townsend Stotesbury was born on February 26, 1849 in Philadelphia. His parents were middle-class Quakers. His father ran a sugar refining business. There was no family fortune, no inherited wealth, nothing that suggested Edward would one day be worth $100 million. He attended public schools and Friends Central School, graduating in 1865 at age 16. He enrolled in what would become Pierce College to study business. The education lasted months, not years. At 17, he needed to work. Stotesbury's first job was as a clerk in a wholesale grocery firm. The work was tedious. The pay was minimal. After a few months, he moved to his father's sugar refining company. The business had connections with Drexel and Company, one of Philadelphia's most prestigious banking houses. In 1866, at age 17, Edward Stotesbury became a clerk at Drexel and Company. His official title was clerk. His actual duties included janitorial work. He swept floors. He organized files. He arrived early and left late. He kept meticulous records of every penny he spent personally, a habit he would maintain his entire life. The firm was led by Anthony Joseph Drexel, a banker whose reputation attracted the most important clients in Philadelphia. Drexel noticed the young clerk who never missed a day, never arrived late, and seemed to understand financial details instinctively. In 1871, Drexel formed a partnership with J. Pierpont Morgan, the New York banker who was beginning to dominate American finance. The partnership created Drexel, Morgan and Company. Stotesbury, still in his early 20s, continued advancing through the firm's departments. By 1875, he was given an interest in the business. On January 1st, 1883, at age 33, Edward Stotesbury became a full partner in Drexel and Company. In the same year, he became a partner in the New York affiliate, which would soon be renamed J.P. Morgan and Company. The partnership made Stotesbury wealthy, but more importantly, it gave him access to the deals that would make him extraordinarily wealthy. Drexel and Morgan specialized in railroad financing and reorganization. In the late 19th century, American railroads were expanding rapidly, requiring enormous capital. Stotesbury became an expert in railroad finance. He helped reorganize dozens of railroads that were failing or poorly managed. The work was technical and unglamorous. Stotesbury restructured debt, negotiated with bondholders, and imposed financial discipline on railroad executives who had been operating with insufficient oversight. The fees were substantial. J. Pierpont Morgan once said that Edward Stotesbury knew more about the details of banking than any other man in the United States. This was not affection. Morgan rarely expressed affection. It was acknowledgement of competence. When Anthony Drexel died in 1893, the New York firm officially became J.P. Morgan and Company. Stotesbury remained senior partner of the Philadelphia office while also serving as senior partner in New York. He was Morgan's man in Philadelphia. The position was lucrative beyond measure. By 1900, Stotesbury's personal income exceeded $1 million annually. In today's terms, over $30 million. He sat on the boards of dozens of companies: Reading Railroad, Lehigh Valley Railroad, Cambria Iron Company, Pennsylvania Steel. The directorships were not ceremonial. Stotesbury controlled enormous capital and knew how to deploy it. In 1909, Stotesbury played a significant role in arranging the International Chinese Loan, a massive financial package that demonstrated American banking power on the world stage. The work required coordination among international banking syndicates. Stotesbury managed the Philadelphia component. By 1910, Edward Stotesbury was 61 years old and one of the wealthiest men in America. His annual income was approaching $5 million. His personal fortune was estimated at over $50 million and growing. He lived alone in a large townhouse on Walnut Street in Philadelphia. His first wife, Frances Berman Butcher, had died in 1881, giving birth to their third daughter. She was 31. Stotesbury had been a widower for 29 years. He had raised 2 surviving daughters alone. Both had married by 1909. The Walnut Street house was dark and empty. Stotesbury was wealthy beyond most men's imagination, but lived a solitary existence. He attended dinners as an extra man, always eligible, never remarrying. Philadelphia society speculated constantly about which young woman might capture his interest. The newspapers linked his name with various candidates. Stotesbury never denied the rumors. He seemed to enjoy them. But he was 61. His daughters were gone. The house was silent except for servants. And somewhere in his methodical banker's mind, Stotesbury must have understood that wealth without purpose was merely numbers in ledgers. In 1910, everything changed. Not because Stotesbury decided to remarry, because he met a woman who decided he would. Eva and Edward, the power marriage. Lucretia Bishop Roberts was born in 1865 in Washington, D.C. Her family called her Eva. Her father, James Roberts, was connected to Washington society, but not wealthy. Eva understood early that beauty and ambition could accomplish what inheritance could not. In 1889, at age 24, Eva married Oliver Eaton Cromwell. He was wealthy, connected to New York society, and exactly the kind of man a beautiful woman from a middle-tier family should marry. Oliver kept an office downtown with a secretary, a stock ticker, and a telephone. His occupation was managing the fortune his father had left him. The marriage produced 3 children: Oliver Eaton Cromwell Jr., James Henry Roberts Cromwell, and Louise Cromwell, who would later marry General Douglas MacArthur. Eva was an attentive mother and an ambitious social climber. She studied how New York society operated. She learned the rules, and she waited for her opportunity. Oliver Cromwell did not have the financial genius of men like Edward Stotesbury. His investments were conservative and increasingly unsuccessful. By the early 1900s, the Cromwell fortune was shrinking. Eva watched this decline with growing concern. In 1909, Oliver Eaton Cromwell died. Eva was 44, a widow with 3 adult children, and a fortune that was considerably smaller than it had appeared. She was still beautiful, still ambitious, and now she was available. Friends suggested a trip to Europe might help with her grief. In early 1910, Eva and her daughter Louise boarded a ship for Europe. The trip was intended to distract her from loss. It accomplished something else entirely. Also on that ship was Edward Townsend Stotesbury, traveling for business. He was 61. She was 45. He was one of the richest men in America. She was a widow who understood exactly how society worked and what it would take to dominate it. The Atlantic crossing took days. Wealthy passengers on these voyages formed temporary societies. Dinners, conversations, the slow reveal of who people were and what they wanted. Ava Cromwell was skilled at these reveals. Edward Stotesbury, who had spent 29 years as Philadelphia's most eligible widower, found himself interested in remarrying. The courtship was not long. Stotesbury was a methodical man who made decisions based on data. Ava represented an opportunity. She understood society in ways he did not. She had connections in New York that Philadelphia money alone could not buy. And she wanted to build something neither of them could build alone. On January 18, 1912, Edward Townsend Stotesbury married Lucretia Bishop Eva Roberts Cromwell. He was 62. She was 46. The wedding was held at Stotesbury's Philadelphia townhouse, which he had spent the previous year renovating in anticipation of marriage. The guest list announced the marriage's significance. J. Pierpont Morgan attended. President William Howard Taft attended. The wedding was not a private family affair. It was a statement that Edward Stotesbury, who had been content with banking success, was now entering a different arena. Society. Eva became stepfather to her 3 adult children. James would later work at Drexel and Company. Louise would marry and divorce Douglas MacArthur before marrying actor Lionel Atwill. The family dynamics were complex but functional. Eva's children understood that their mother's remarriage secured their social position permanently. The townhouse renovation had been extensive. Stotesbury hired Joseph Duveen, the legendary art dealer and designer who worked for the Morgans, Vanderbilts, and Rockefellers. Duveen installed a Tiffany glass skylight above the grand staircase. He brought in marble for the entryway. He purchased Dolly Madison's fireplace from the White House and installed it in the residence. For Eva's son James, who was athletic, Stotesbury built a squash court on the 5th floor. The gesture was calculated. He was buying not just Eva, but her family's loyalty and integration into his life. In 1914, Eva decided the townhouse needed a ballroom for entertaining. Stotesbury hired Joseph Duveen again. Duveen imported an entire Georgian ballroom from a lord's manor in England. 500 craftsmen spent over a year reassembling it in Philadelphia. They installed crystal Louis XV chandeliers, a 14th century Italian marble fireplace, gold ceiling panels, marble Corinthian columns, an organ and orchestra area above the entrance doors. The press called it the largest and grandest townhouse on the entire East Coast. But Eva's ambitions extended beyond a Philadelphia townhouse. She wanted estates, multiple residences that would allow her to entertain in different seasons. Summer in Maine, winter in Florida, spring and fall in Philadelphia. The lifestyle of families like the Vanderbilts, who moved through the year following society's calendar. Stotesbury, who had spent decades accumulating wealth without spending it ostentatiously, now had a wife who understood that wealth's purpose was display, not vulgar display, strategic display, the kind that made other wealthy families acknowledge your position. In 1916, Eva convinced Edward to purchase land outside Philadelphia, 300 acres in Springfield Township, an area that was still rural but accessible. The location was perfect for what Eva envisioned, an estate that would rival anything the Vanderbilts or Astors had built. Stotesbury agreed. He was 67 years old and worth an estimated $75 million. Building a great house was something men of his position did, and if Eva wanted to manage the project, she had proven she could do it successfully. They hired Horace Trumbauer, Philadelphia's most prominent architect, and they began planning what would become the 3rd largest private residence in American history. The marriage between Edward and Eva Stotesbury was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was a partnership. He provided unlimited capital. She provided social expertise and ambition. Together, they would build something that neither could have built alone. Whitemarsh Hall would be their masterpiece. Horace Trumbauer and the design. Horace Trumbauer was 50 years old when the Stotesburys hired him in 1916. He was self-taught, having started as a draftsman and worked his way up through talent rather than formal architectural education. By the 1910s, Trumbauer was the architect of choice for Philadelphia's wealthiest families. His portfolio included dozens of estates. He had designed the original buildings for Duke University. He would later design the Philadelphia Museum of Art. His style was Beaux-Arts, favoring classical proportions and Georgian or Palladian details. Trumbauer understood that great houses required not just scale, but mathematical precision in their proportions. The Stotesburys gave Trumbauer a nearly unlimited budget and a clear directive: build something that would be recognized as one of America's greatest private residences. Ava wanted American Versailles. Edward wanted permanence. Trumbauer would give them both. The site was 300 acres in Springfield Township, north of Philadelphia proper. The land was gently rolling, with mature trees and good drainage. Trumbauer positioned the main house to take advantage of the topography, allowing for extensive formal gardens that would stretch from the mansion toward the property boundaries. The design Trumbauer produced was Georgian in style, with Palladian influences. The facade would be Indiana limestone, the same material used in many great American buildings. The mansion would rise 6 stories, though only 3 would be visible from the exterior. Trumbauer planned 3 underground floors to maintain the building's elegant proportions while providing necessary service spaces. The decision to build 3 floors underground was architectural sophistication that distinguished Whitemarsh from cruder displays of wealth. The visible facade would remain harmonious, with proper ratios between height and width. The underground floors would contain kitchens, storage, mechanical systems, and staff quarters. Function hidden beneath beauty. Construction began in 1916. The United States would enter World War I the following year, but the war did not stop construction at Whitemarsh. Stotesbury's wealth and connections ensured that materials and labor remained available. Over 2,500 workers were employed at various stages of construction. The foundation was massive, designed to support not just the building but the weight of marble floors, the organ that would rise 3 stories, and the structural loads that a house of this scale required. The limestone came from Indiana quarries, selected for color consistency and quality. Every block was inspected before installation. The standards were uncompromising. This was not a house being built for one generation. Trumbauer designed Whitemarsh to stand for centuries. The structure's steel frame was engineered by specialists who typically worked on commercial buildings rather than residences. The complexity of a 6-story structure, with much of its weight underground, required engineering beyond typical domestic construction. As the limestone walls rose, the scale became apparent to anyone passing the construction site. This was not merely a large house. This was architecture on an institutional scale adapted for private use. The facade stretched over 400 feet at its widest point. The proportions were deliberately calculated to avoid overwhelming viewers, while still announcing the building's importance. Joseph Duveen, who had worked on the Philadelphia townhouse, was brought in to manage interior design and procurement. Duveen's expertise was sourcing the finest materials and antiques from Europe. For Whitemarsh, he scoured England, France, and Italy. Marble came from Italy, not ordinary marble. Carrara marble for fireplaces, sea green and white marble for floors and walls. The Italians who installed it were specialists brought to Pennsylvania specifically for this project. Furniture came from France, Georgian pieces from England, Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers. Duveen understood that a house of this scale could not be furnished with new pieces alone. Antiques provided the patina of age that suggested the Stotesburys were not merely rich but established. The ballroom required special attention. Trumbauer designed it to accommodate several hundred guests, with a 64-foot length that would allow for proper dancing and entertaining. The ceiling height was calculated to prevent the room from feeling cavernous, while allowing sound to carry properly during performances. Medieval tapestries were acquired for the ballroom walls. Twin fireplaces with Carrara marble mantelpieces were installed at opposite ends. Crystal chandeliers were custom-made to Trumbauer's specifications, sized to the room's proportions, rather than purchased from existing stock. The organ was a technical challenge. Pipe organs typically require dedicated spaces with specific acoustical properties. Trumbauer designed the organ to rise 3 stories, with pipes visible in the main living areas and mechanisms hidden in the floors above. The instrument could be heard throughout the mansion. Eva loved organ music and intended for it to play continuously during parties. Bathrooms numbered 28, though some sources suggest as many as 45 when servants' facilities are included. The discrepancy reflects the ambiguity of counting bathrooms in a structure this large. Were powder rooms counted separately? Servants' facilities? The exact number mattered less than the fact that Whitemarsh's plumbing system was engineered for dozens of simultaneous users. Bronze dolphin faucets were installed in the family bathrooms. 5-foot by 10-foot gilt mirrors were positioned throughout the house, particularly along staircases where they would multiply light and create an impression of even greater space. Marble statues and urns from Italy filled both interior spaces and the grounds. The kitchens were underground, along with food storage, wine cellars, and the mechanical systems that would heat and cool the mansion. A refrigeration plant was installed, industrial in scale, capable of preserving food for the large staff and frequent entertaining the Stotesburys planned. A movie theater was included, along with a gymnasium. These were amenities that went beyond even typical Gilded Age excess. The theater could screen films for family and guests. The gymnasium reflected Eva's interest in maintaining physical fitness, unusual for a woman of her generation and social class. The construction process took 5 years. Delays were minimal, a testament to Stotesbury's willingness to pay whatever was necessary to keep work progressing. Labor disputes did not affect Whitemarsh. Material shortages were solved with money. By 1920, the exterior was complete and interior work was finishing. Trumbauer's design had been executed almost exactly as planned. The limestone facade rose with perfect proportions. The underground floors provided all necessary service functions without compromising the building's visual elegance. The grounds were still being developed. Formal gardens would take years to mature. But the house itself was ready. 147 rooms across 100,000 square feet. 6 floors. A structure that had cost approximately $10 million when construction costs and furnishings were combined. In 1921, Edward and Eva Stotesbury moved into Whitemarsh Hall. He was 72 years old. She was 56. They had built something that would force American society to acknowledge them not just as wealthy, but as significant. Horace Trumbauer had delivered on his commission. Whitemarsh Hall was not just large. It was architecturally sophisticated, beautifully proportioned, and built to standards that would ensure it could stand for centuries. No one in 1921 imagined it would be demolished in 59 years. Inside Whitemarsh, the completed palace. 147 rooms. The number became shorthand for Whitemarsh Hall's scale, though it failed to capture what those rooms actually contained. The entrance hall set the tone immediately. Visitors entered through massive bronze doors into a space finished in white marble and limestone. Natural light came from above through a skylight that Trumbauer had positioned to illuminate without overwhelming. The floor was marble, polished to reflect light upward. The effect was both grand and welcoming, a difficult balance that Trumbauer achieved through proportion rather than ornament. From the entrance hall, guests could access the main living areas. The grand staircase rose to the second floor, with those 5-foot by 10-foot gilt mirrors positioned to multiply the space visually. The mirrors were not decoration. They were architectural tools that made the interior feel even larger than its actual dimensions. The ballroom was Whitemarsh's centerpiece, 64 feet in length, with ceilings high enough to prevent the space from feeling oppressive, but not so high that sound would dissipate. The medieval tapestries on the walls absorbed excess sound while adding visual richness. The twin Carrara marble fireplaces at opposite ends provided symmetry and, during winter months, actual warmth despite the room's size. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, custom designed to complement the room's proportions. The floor was hardwood, maintained to a finish that allowed for dancing without being dangerously slick. This was a room built for performance. Eva's parties would often include over 200 guests. The ballroom could accommodate them comfortably while still allowing for circulation. At one end of the ballroom, slightly elevated, was the organ console. The instrument's pipes rose through 3 floors of the mansion. When played, the organ could be heard in nearly every room. Eva insisted on this. She believed that organ music created atmosphere that no other instrument could provide. During parties, the organ played continuously, unless live performances were scheduled. Adjacent to the ballroom was a smaller music room, designed for intimate performances, chamber music, vocalists. The acoustics here were different, calibrated for smaller groups and quieter instruments. Eva entertained frequently, and not every event required the ballroom's scale. The dining room seated 40 guests formally, though smaller configurations were possible for family meals. The table was custom-made, designed to match the room's proportions. Chairs were upholstered in needlework that Eva had commissioned from European craftsmen. Paintings lined the walls, selected for their ability to withstand viewing during long dinners without becoming tiresome. The kitchen was underground, connected to the dining room by a service elevator and stairs that allowed staff to move between floors without being visible to guests. The kitchen was industrial in scale, with multiple ovens, preparation areas, and storage that could support dinners for dozens of guests on short notice. The wine cellar was also underground, secured behind locked doors with an alarm system. During Prohibition, which began in 1920, this security became essential. Stotesbury maintained his wine collection despite the law. The multiple locks and alarm were not paranoia. They were practical precautions against theft by staff or intrusion by authorities. The library was positioned on the first floor, with windows overlooking the gardens. The room was lined with built-in bookshelves, though Edward Stotesbury famously never read books. His intelligence was financial, not literary. The library existed because houses of this importance required libraries, regardless of whether the owners actually used them. Eva's sitting room was adjacent to her bedroom suite on the second floor. This was her private space for managing household affairs, corresponding with guests, and planning the social calendar that justified Whitemarsh's existence. The room was decorated in French style, with furniture Eva had selected personally during trips to Europe. Edward's bedroom suite was separate from Eva's, following upper-class conventions of the era. His rooms were simpler than hers, decorated in darker woods and heavier furniture that reflected masculine tastes of the period. He maintained a study adjacent to his bedroom, where he could work privately when not at his Philadelphia office. Guest bedrooms filled much of the second floor. Each was decorated individually, no two alike. The Stotesburys expected guests to stay for days or weeks, not overnight. The bedrooms needed to be comfortable for extended visits. Each had its own bathroom, though servants' rooms shared facilities. The third floor was primarily servants' quarters. More than 40 staff lived at Whitemarsh when the house was fully operational. Housemaids, kitchen staff, valets, ladies' maids, footmen. Each had a small bedroom, simply furnished. The servants' dining room was on this floor along with their sitting areas. The separation between family and staff was absolute in the house's design. The gymnasium was unexpected for a private residence of this era. Eva believed in physical fitness, unusual for a woman her age in the 1920s. The gymnasium included equipment for various exercises, and Eva used it regularly. This was not for display. This was functional space for personal use. The movie theater seated approximately 20 people. A projection room was built adjacent, with equipment that could screen the latest films. Movies were a new entertainment form in the 1920s, and having a private theater placed the Stotesburys at the forefront of technological adoption. The underground floors contained more than just service spaces. The refrigeration plant operated constantly, keeping food fresh and the house cool during summer months. This was before residential air conditioning was common. The refrigeration system was essentially industrial, adapted for domestic use. Storage rooms filled much of the underground space. Furniture not currently in use, linens, china and silver for parties, holiday decorations, equipment for the grounds. The Stotesburys accumulated possessions at a scale that required dedicated storage infrastructure. The elevators were essential given the mansion's 6 floors. 3 elevators served different parts of the house, allowing family, guests, and servants to move vertically without interacting. This separation was critical to maintaining the social structures that governed houses like Whitemarsh. Bathrooms throughout the mansion featured bronze dolphin faucets in family areas, simpler fixtures in servants' quarters. The plumbing system was engineered to support simultaneous use by dozens of people. Water pressure had to be maintained on all 6 floors, including the 3 underground levels. The basement also housed Stotesbury's art collection storage. He had been collecting English 18th century portraits for decades, beginning long before he married Eva. His collection was considered one of the top 3 in America, alongside those of Henry Clay Frick and Henry Edwards Huntington. Many of these paintings hung in Whitemarsh's public rooms, but additional pieces required climate-controlled storage. Throughout the house, gilt and plasterwork decorated ceilings and walls where appropriate. But Trumbauer had been restrained. The decoration enhanced rather than overwhelmed. This was sophisticated wealth, not nouveau riche excess. Every door in Whitemarsh was solid wood, custom-made for its location. Hardware was bronze throughout, not brass or cheaper metals. Window treatments were custom woven. Rugs were Persian, selected individually for each room. Nothing was standard. Nothing was purchased without consideration of how it would integrate into the whole. The result was a house that functioned as both residence and stage. The Stotesburys lived here, but they also performed here. The mansion's design accommodated both purposes seamlessly. When Whitemarsh was completed in 1921, it represented the pinnacle of Gilded Age residential architecture, larger than almost any private home in America, more sophisticated in its design than most, and built to standards that should have ensured survival for centuries. The house was ready. Now it needed to fulfill the purpose for which it was built, establishing the Stotesburys as unquestionably significant figures in American society. The grounds, an American Versailles. The mansion was extraordinary. The grounds surrounding it were what made Whitemarsh unforgettable. 400 acres. The Stotesburys had expanded from the original 300 purchased in 1916. The additional land gave them complete control over everything visible from the house, and created a buffer between their estate and the encroaching development that was slowly transforming rural Springfield Township. 70 gardeners worked the grounds full-time, not part-time laborers hired seasonally. 70 men employed year-round to maintain gardens, lawns, trees, and the infrastructure that kept everything functioning. The formal gardens were French in style, inspired directly by Versailles. Geometric patterns laid out with mathematical precision. Hedges trimmed to exact heights. Gravel paths that crunched underfoot, defining circulation routes through the planted areas. Fountains positioned at focal points where multiple paths intersected. The main vista extended from the mansion's south-facing terrace down a gentle slope toward the property boundary. The perspective was carefully calculated. Standing on the terrace, visitors could see across hundreds of yards of manicured landscape without a single element that suggested the 20th century. No telephone poles, no roads, no buildings, just controlled nature arranged for maximum visual impact. Statuary punctuated the gardens, marble urns from Italy, classical figures on pedestals. Nothing was random. Each piece was positioned to enhance specific views or terminate sightlines. The Stotesburys purchased these elements through Joseph Duveen, who sourced them from European estates that were selling off contents. 4 large greenhouses occupied a service area screened from the main house by plantings. These were not small garden structures. These were industrial-scale greenhouses designed to grow specific plants that could not survive Pennsylvania winters outdoors. 2 of the greenhouses grew trees and ferns, large specimens that would be moved into the mansion during winter months to maintain the illusion of perpetual summer inside. The logistics of moving full-grown trees required specialized equipment and staff trained in horticulture at a level far beyond typical gardening. The other 2 greenhouses grew flowers. Continuous blooms year-round. Eva insisted on fresh flowers throughout Whitemarsh regardless of season. The greenhouses produced roses, orchids, lilies, and dozens of other species that were cut daily and arranged by staff trained in floral design. During parties, the flower requirements increased exponentially. every room needed arrangements. The ballroom alone required dozens of large displays. The greenhouses operated at full capacity to meet these demands, supplemented by purchases from commercial growers when Eva's entertainments exceeded even the greenhouse's substantial output. The Belvedere stood at the highest point on the property, offering views across the entire estate and toward Philadelphia in the distance. The structure was classical in design, open-sided with columns supporting a domed roof. Guests could walk there during parties for conversation away from the main house. Additional service buildings dotted the property, maintenance shops where equipment was repaired, storage for groundskeeping tools and vehicles, housing for some of the 70 gardeners, though most lived off the property and commuted daily. The estate operated like a small village, with infrastructure to support its population and activities. A private railroad siding connected to the property, though the exact location and configuration varied in different accounts. What is clear is that guests could arrive by private rail car, which was standard for the wealthiest families of the era. The Stotesburys entertained people who traveled by private train as a matter of course. The gardens required constant maintenance: spring planting, summer watering and weeding, fall cleanup, winter preparation. The 70 gardeners worked in teams, each responsible for specific areas. The head gardener managed them with the authority of a military commander, ensuring that no section of the property ever appeared neglected. Water features required particular attention. Fountains needed to operate reliably during parties. Pools needed to be kept clean. The mechanical systems that circulated water and created the visual effect of flowing fountains were hidden underground, accessible only to maintenance staff who understood the plumbing. Lighting was installed throughout the grounds for evening entertaining. Not crude floodlights, but carefully positioned fixtures that illuminated paths and highlighted specific plantings or statuary without creating harsh brightness. The electrical infrastructure required to power outdoor lighting across 400 acres was substantial. In the early 1920s, Georges Clemenceau visited Whitemarsh. Clemenceau had been Premier of France during World War I, a figure of international significance. His opinion mattered. Eva made certain his visit included a complete tour of the grounds. Standing in the formal gardens, looking back toward the mansion with its perfect proportions and the landscape stretching around it, Clemenceau reportedly said this reminded him of Versailles. The comparison was exactly what Eva wanted. The Versailles of America became Whitemarsh's nickname, repeated in newspapers and society columns. The comparison was not entirely accurate. Versailles occupied over 2,000 acres and served as the seat of French royal power for over a century. Whitemarsh was 400 acres and had existed for less than a decade, but the nickname captured something true. The Stotesburys had created a landscape that suggested European grandeur adapted to American scale. The grounds were not just beautiful, they were expensive. The 70 gardeners required salaries, housing, equipment, and supervision. The greenhouses consumed coal for heating and required constant attention. The fountains needed maintenance. The paths needed raking. The hedges needed trimming. The lawns needed mowing with equipment that was primitive by modern standards. Edward Stotesbury reportedly spent over $1 million annually to maintain Whitemarsh and its grounds. In today's terms, over $18 million per year, just to keep the house and property operating, not to improve them, not to expand them, simply to maintain what already existed. For a man worth $100 million in the 1920s, this was sustainable, but it left no margin for error. If the fortune declined, the maintenance costs would not. The grounds required the same level of care regardless of whether Stotesbury could afford it. In the mid-1920s, this seemed irrelevant. Stotesbury's wealth was growing, not shrinking. His income from Drexel & Company and J.P. Morgan exceeded $5 million annually. $1 million for maintenance was 20% of annual income. Substantial but manageable. The grounds of Whitemarsh Hall represented the pinnacle of American landscape architecture applied to private estates. They were beautiful, sophisticated, and maintained to standards that rivaled public parks. They also represented a level of expense that could only be sustained by extraordinary wealth. In 1925, That wealth seemed permanent. The gardens bloomed, the fountains flowed, and Eva Stotesbury prepared to use this spectacular setting for what she did best: entertaining. The party years, 1921 to 1929. Whitemarsh Hall was not built to be lived in quietly. It was built to be performed in. And between 1921 and 1929, Eva Stotesbury performed brilliantly. The parties began almost immediately after the mansion was completed. Eva invited hundreds of guests to events that ranged from formal dinners to elaborate balls. Her guest lists included everyone who mattered in American society and many who mattered internationally. Henry Ford visited Whitemarsh. After touring the house and grounds, Ford reportedly said it was a great experience to see how the rich live. Coming from one of America's wealthiest men, the comment was both admiring and slightly mocking. Ford's fortune came from manufacturing efficiency and mass production. Stotesbury's came from finance. The two approaches to wealth were fundamentally different, and Ford's comment captured that tension. Opera stars performed at Whitemarsh after their shows at Philadelphia's opera houses. Eva would host midnight suppers following performances, bringing together performers and society in her ballroom. The organ played continuously during these events unless live musicians were scheduled. Presidents visited. William McKinley had attended events at the Philadelphia Town House. Theodore Roosevelt had been a guest. The connection between American political power and American financial power was intimate in this era, and the Stotesburys represented financial power at its apex. Eva's stepdaughter, Louise Cromwell, married General Douglas MacArthur on February 14, 1922. The wedding was a major social event, though the marriage would end in divorce 7 years later. MacArthur was already a prominent military figure, and his connection to the Stotesbury family through marriage elevated both his social standing and theirs. Eva's stepson, James H.R. Cromwell, worked at Drexel and Company after World War I service. On June 17, 1920, he married Delphine Dodge, the only daughter of Horace Dodge, co-founder of Dodge Motor Company. The marriage brought together two significant American fortunes. That marriage also ended in divorce in 1928. In 1935, James Cromwell would marry Doris Duke, who was called the richest girl in the world, following her inheritance of the Duke tobacco fortune. The Cromwell children's marriages were strategic, connecting the Stotesbury family to automotive, tobacco, and military power in addition to their banking connections. The household staff during these years numbered over 40 people living at Whitemarsh: housemaids who maintained the rooms, kitchen staff who prepared meals for family and guests, footmen who served at table, valets and ladies' maids who attended to personal needs, a butler who managed the household hierarchy. But the staff did not stay at Whitemarsh year-round. The Stotesburys moved seasonally, and most staff traveled with them. Spring and fall at Whitemarsh. Winter at El Mirasol in Palm Beach, Florida. Summer at Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, Maine. El Mirasol was designed by Addison Misner and completed in 1919. The 37-room estate cost over $1 million and featured a 40-car garage, an auditorium, and a private zoo. The house ran from ocean to lake in Palm Beach, with a tea house and dock for Stotesbury's yacht, the Nadeva. Wingwood House in Bar Harbor was completed in 1927, designed by the architectural firm Magaziner, Eberhard and Harris. The main estate provided a summer retreat where the Stotesburys could escape Philadelphia's heat and humidity. Managing 3 estates and the seasonal movement of staff and possessions was a logistics operation that Eva supervised personally. Furniture would be covered at whichever estate they were leaving. Trunks would be packed. Staff would travel ahead to prepare the next residence. The Stotesburys would arrive to find everything ready for occupation. This lifestyle required not just wealth but organizational ability. Eva excelled at both the social performance and the behind-the-scenes management that made the performance possible. She maintained detailed guest lists. She planned menus weeks in advance. She coordinated with florists, musicians, and caterers to ensure that every event met her standards. The parties at Whitemarsh during the 1920s were legendary. Eva would invite 200 or more guests to balls in the 64-foot ballroom. The crystal chandeliers would blaze with light. The organ would play. Medieval tapestries absorbed sound while adding visual grandeur. Twin fires crackled in the Carrara marble fireplaces. Eva wore her jewelry collection to these events. Significant pieces acquired through decades of wealth. The jewels were not just valuable, they were statements of position. Other women noticed what Eva wore and adjusted their own acquisitions accordingly. Competition in society was often conducted through jewelry, clothing, and the quality of one's entertainments. Edward Stotesbury occasionally performed at these parties. He had been a drummer boy during the Civil War as a teenager, and he remained a skilled percussionist. Guests would encourage him to play, and the elderly banker would demonstrate that his hands retained their precision, even in his 70s. The parties were not just social, they were strategic. Eva used Whitemarsh to cement relationships that benefited Edward's business interests. A dinner invitation to Whitemarsh was valuable currency. People granted that invitation felt obligated to reciprocate through business favors, introductions, or support when needed. But beneath the glamour, maintaining this lifestyle consumed resources at an astonishing rate. The annual cost of operating Whitemarsh alone exceeded $1 million. El Mirasol and Wingwood added hundreds of thousands more. The combined maintenance of 3 estates, plus the Philadelphia townhouse, meant Stotesbury needed to generate over $2 million annually just to sustain his existing lifestyle. Between 1921 and 1929, this was possible. Stotesbury's income from his partnerships at Drexel and J.P. Morgan exceeded $5 million annually. The expenses were substantial, but the income was greater. The fortune continued growing despite the lavish spending. In 1927, Stotesbury's personal fortune was estimated at $100 million. In today's terms, approximately $1.8 billion. He was unquestionably one of the wealthiest men in America. The parties continued. The seasonal migrations proceeded like clockwork, and Whitemarsh Hall stood as proof that American wealth had reached heights that rivaled anything European aristocracy had achieved. Georges Clemenceau's comparison to Versailles seemed justified. Eva Stotesbury had accomplished exactly what she intended. She and Edward were not just wealthy, they were significant. Their names appeared in newspapers constantly. Their social position was unassailable. In October 1929, everything changed. 1929. The fortune evaporates. The stock market crashed on October 24, 1929. Black Thursday, panic selling, margin calls that could not be met, fortunes that had seemed permanent disappeared in hours. Edward Stotesbury was 79 years old. He had survived every financial crisis since the 1870s. Panics in 1873, 1893, 1907. Each time, his careful management and conservative approach had protected his wealth. He had been born poor and accumulated $100 million through methodical discipline. The 1929 crash was different. Stotesbury's wealth was not in cash. It was in securities, partnerships, and investments that depended on market values remaining stable. When the market collapsed, those values evaporated. Paper wealth disappeared. The immediate impact was not catastrophic. Stotesbury still had enormous resources, but the trajectory changed. Instead of wealth growing annually, it began shrinking, and the expenses did not shrink with it. Whitemarsh Hall still required $1 million annually for maintenance. El Mirasol and Wingwood still required their operating budgets. The 70 gardeners still needed salaries. The 40 household staff still needed wages. The seasonal migration still required funding. Nothing about the lifestyle became less expensive. Between 1933 and 1938, Edward Stotesbury withdrew $55 million from his J.P. Morgan account. This was not investment. This was consumption. He was spending principal, not income. The withdrawal rate exceeded $10 million per year. The mathematics were brutal. A fortune of $100 million, diminished by market crashes and then consumed at $10 million per year, would be exhausted in a decade. Stotesbury was racing toward insolvency, and he seemed unable to stop. Why did he not reduce expenses? The question has an uncomfortable answer. Reducing expenses meant admitting defeat. It meant closing estates, dismissing staff, ending the lifestyle that defined who the Stotesburys had become. Edward had spent decades building wealth. Eva had spent a decade building their social position. Neither could accept that it was ending. There were also practical considerations. How do you sell a house like Whitemarsh Hall during the Depression? Who could afford to buy it? Who would want to maintain it? The same questions applied to El Mirasol and Wingwood. These properties were not liquid assets. They were albatrosses. The art collection might have been sold. Stotesbury owned one of America's finest collections of English 18th century portraits. The paintings were valuable, but the art market had collapsed along with everything else. Selling in the 1930s would mean accepting cents on the dollar. Stotesbury waited, hoping markets would recover. His stepson, James H.R. Cromwell, had married Doris Duke in February 1935. Both supported Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. James had become a devoted New Dealer, advocating for government intervention in the economy and tighter control of financial institutions like those his stepfather had helped build. The political disagreement between Stotesbury and his stepson was profound. In 1936, Stotesbury told James, "It's a good thing you married the richest girl in the world, because you will get very little from me. I made my fortune, and I am going to squander it myself, not your friend Roosevelt." The comment was revealing. Stotesbury understood he was squandering his fortune. He was not passively watching it disappear. He was actively spending it, maintaining a lifestyle that no longer made financial sense. The word squander was his own choice, an acknowledgement of what he was doing. But he could not stop. 79 years old in 1930, 80 in 1931. At what age does a man abandon everything he has built and admit he cannot sustain it? Stotesbury chose to continue until the money was gone. The withdrawals from J.P. Morgan continued, $55 million over 5 years. The fortune that had taken decades to accumulate was being consumed to maintain estates and a lifestyle that served no purpose except displaying wealth that was disappearing. Eva watched this decline with increasing concern. She had married Edward for his fortune and the social position it could provide. The social position remained intact through much of the 1930s. But the fortune was dying. And Eva, who had managed 3 households with military precision, could not manage the simple arithmetic that was destroying them. The 1920s had been performance. The 1930s became survival. The parties at Whitemarsh continued, but less frequently. The seasonal migrations proceeded, but with smaller staff. The gardens were maintained, but perhaps not quite to the same standard. Small compromises that acknowledged what neither Edward nor Eva could say directly. The money was running out. By 1935, Stotesbury's fortune had declined from $100 million to approximately $10 million. Still wealthy by any reasonable standard, but not wealthy enough to sustain 3 estates and the infrastructure required to operate them. And the expenses continued. $1 million annually for Whitemarsh alone. The number never changed. The house required what it required. The 70 gardeners could not become 35 without the grounds deteriorating visibly. The 40 household staff could not become 20 without service standards declining. Compromise was visible, and visibility was defeat. Edward Stotesbury had built his fortune through discipline and careful management. He was destroying it through inability to accept that the world had changed, and his lifestyle could not survive that change. The market crash of 1929 killed many fortunes, but Stotesbury's fortune was not killed by the crash. It was killed by his refusal to adapt to the crash's consequences. He chose to spend himself into poverty rather than live differently. By 1938, the withdrawals from J.P. Morgan had reduced his liquid assets to approximately $4 million. The estates remained, but they were unsellable. The art collection remained, but markets were depressed. The lifestyle remained, but it was consuming everything. Stotesbury was 89 years old, and the money that had defined his entire adult life was almost gone. 1932 to 1935, public backlash and private tragedy. The Great Depression was not merely a financial crisis. It was a social upheaval that changed how Americans viewed wealth and those who possessed it. In 1932, unemployment exceeded 20%. Banks failed. Families lost homes. Breadlines stretched through cities. And in Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, Whitemarsh Hall stood with its 70 gardeners maintaining 400 acres of manicured grounds. The contrast was obscene. Deliberately visible obscenity. Public criticism of the Stotesburys intensified through the early 1930s. Newspapers that had fawned over Eva's parties now questioned whether such displays were appropriate when millions were starving. Radio commentators were less restrained. One reportedly suggested that someone should plant a bomb at Whitemarsh Hall. Whether this was serious threat or inflammatory rhetoric remains unclear. But the Stotesburys heard it. The message was unmistakable. They were not admired anymore. They were resented. In June 1932, the Stotesburys closed Whitemarsh Hall and left for Europe. They spent the summer on the French Riviera, away from American anger and depression realities. They returned to the United States in October, but did not reopen Whitemarsh immediately. The family spent winter at El Mirasol in Palm Beach as usual. But when spring came in 1933, the decision to reopen Whitemarsh was fraught. The house had been closed for nearly a year. The staff had been maintained at reduced levels, but not dismissed entirely. The gardens had been kept, but not to previous standards. When Whitemarsh reopened in spring 1933, the parties resumed. But they were different. Guest lists were smaller. Entertainment was less elaborate. Eva was more circumspect about publicity. The social performance continued, but with the awareness that the audience now included people who hated them. The criticism was not just moral, it was personal. The Stotesburys were accused of indifference to suffering, of maintaining extravagance while the nation suffered. The accusations were not entirely fair. Stotesbury had lost tens of millions in the crash like many others. But they were not entirely wrong either. He was spending millions annually to maintain houses while unemployment lines stretched for blocks. Political pressure increased. Franklin Roosevelt had been elected president in November 1932. The New Deal represented a fundamental shift in American politics, with government intervention in the economy and implicit criticism of the financial system that men like Stotesbury had built. James H.R. Cromwell, Eva's son, was an enthusiastic New Dealer. His support for Roosevelt and progressive policies created tension within the family. The 1936 conversation where Stotesbury told James he was squandering his fortune rather than giving it to your friend Roosevelt was not joking. It was genuine political and personal disagreement. The Stotesburys were watching their world end, not just financially, but ideologically. The system that had allowed Edward to rise from clerk to partner, accumulating $100 million, was being criticized as fundamentally unjust. The lifestyle that Eva had perfected was being condemned as morally reprehensible. They could not defend themselves effectively. Any public statement would be dissected and used against them. Silence seemed safer. They continued their lives more quietly, hoping the anger would fade. It did not fade. It intensified. In April 1935, Edward Stotesbury's daughter Edith died. Edith Lewis Stotesbury had married Sidney Emlyn Hutchinson in December 1903. She was 58 years old when she died. The cause was not widely reported. Edith's death devastated Edward. She was his second daughter from his first marriage to Frances, who had died in childbirth in 1881. Edward had raised Edith largely alone during his decades as a widower. Her death represented a connection to his past that could not be replaced. The parties at Whitemarsh stopped after Edith died. Not officially. There was no announcement. But Eva stopped planning elaborate entertainments. The ballroom that had hosted hundreds of guests stood empty. The organ that had played continuously during parties was silent. Edward was 86 years old. His daughter was dead. His fortune was disappearing. Public opinion had turned against him. And Whitemarsh Hall, which had been built to announce his significance, now felt like a monument to a world that no longer existed. The staff remained. The 70 gardeners continued their work. The 40 household employees maintained the house. But the purpose was gone. They were maintaining a stage where no performances were scheduled. Eva tried to revive the social calendar in late 1935 and 1936. Small dinners, intimate gatherings. Nothing like the grand balls of the 1920s. She was performing for an audience that had lost interest or actively wished her gone. The financial pressure was relentless. The withdrawals from J.P. Morgan continued at over $10 million annually. The estate still required their budgets. The lifestyle still consumed resources that were not being replenished. Between 1932 and 1935, the Stotesburys experienced what many American families experienced during the Depression: loss, criticism, and the slow realization that their previous life was not returning. The difference was scale. Most families lost homes and struggled to afford food. The Stotesburys lost tens of millions and struggled to maintain 3 estates. The suffering was not comparable, but it was real. Edward Stotesbury had worked for over 70 years to build his fortune. He was watching it disappear while being told he deserved to lose it. Eva had spent 15 years building their social position. She was watching it become worthless while being told she had never deserved it. By 1936, Whitemarsh Hall had become a burden rather than a showcase. The parties had stopped. The public hated them. The money was running out. And Edward Stotesbury, at 87, was running out of time. May 16, 1938, Stotesbury dies. Edward Townsend Stotesbury died at Whitemarsh Hall on May 16, 1938. He was 89 years old. The cause was listed as complications from age. He had been in declining health for months. He died in the mansion he had built 17 years earlier, the house that was supposed to establish his legacy, the structure that had cost $10 million and was now worth a fraction of that amount in a depressed market where no one was buying estates. The funeral was held in Philadelphia. Stotesbury was buried at Woodland Cemetery, a prestigious burial ground where many of Philadelphia's prominent families interred their dead. The service was well attended despite the Depression and despite the public criticism the Stotesburys had endured. Death commanded respect even when life had generated resentment. The probate process revealed what Eva had suspected but not fully understood. They were nearly broke. Stotesbury's estate was valued at approximately $4 million. $4 million. From a peak of $100 million in 1927. 11 years had consumed 96% of his fortune. The math was brutal and simple. $55 million withdrawn from J.P. Morgan between 1933 and 1938. Market losses that had wiped out tens of millions more. The combination had destroyed one of America's greatest fortunes in little more than a decade. But the numbers were actually worse than they appeared. The $4 million valuation included Whitemarsh Hall, El Mirasol, and Wingwood House. The 3 estates were assessed at values that assumed they could be sold. In reality, who would buy them? Who could afford to maintain them? The art collection was included in the valuation. Stotesbury's English 18th century portraits, accumulated over decades and considered one of America's finest collections. But art markets were depressed. The assessed value meant nothing if no buyers existed. The will specified that Eva would have lifetime use of Whitemarsh Hall. She could live there as long as she chose. But the estate trust that was supposed to provide her income was woefully insufficient. The trust generated approximately 1/4 of what it cost to operate Whitemarsh Hall annually. 1/4. If maintenance required $1 million per year, the trust provided $250,000. Eva would need to find the remaining $750,000 from other sources. She had no other sources. Eva was 73 years old. She had been married to Edward for 26 years. She had helped him spend $100 million building and maintaining a lifestyle that now could not be sustained for even one more year. The realization was devastating. Eva had assumed there would be sufficient funds after Edward's death. She had not involved herself in the financial details beyond managing household budgets and planning entertainments. The actual state of the finances had been Edward's domain. He had not shared the full truth with her, or perhaps he had refused to acknowledge it himself. Within weeks of Edward's death, Eva made the only decision possible. She closed Whitemarsh Hall permanently. The house that had been built as a monument to their significance would sit empty. The staff was dismissed. 40 household employees who had worked at Whitemarsh for years, many for nearly 2 decades, were let go. No severance that would allow them to maintain themselves while seeking new employment. Just dismissal. The Depression made finding new positions nearly impossible for domestic workers whose skills were specific to grand houses that no longer existed. The 70 gardeners were dismissed. Men who had maintained 400 acres to perfection received notice that their employment was ending. The gardens they had cultivated would be left to grow wild. Eva kept a skeleton staff to prevent vandalism and maintain minimal security. But Whitemarsh, as a functioning residence, was finished. The rooms where hundreds had danced stood empty. The ballroom where the organ had played continuously was silent. The greenhouses where flowers had bloomed year-round were closed. Eva moved to El Mirasol in Palm Beach. The Florida estate was smaller than Whitemarsh and less expensive to maintain. It could be operated with a fraction of the staff. More importantly, Palm Beach society was less aware of the Stotesburys' financial situation. Eva could maintain appearances more easily there than in Philadelphia, where everyone knew Edward had died nearly broke. But even El Mirasol was unsustainable long-term. The annual operating costs, while lower than Whitemarsh, still exceeded what Eva could afford. She would need to sell assets. The question was which assets and how to maximize their value in a market that was not buying. The Philadelphia townhouse where she and Edward had married could be sold. Parts of it, at least. In 1925, the Philippatrian Club had purchased a portion of the townhouse and much of the art collection displayed there. The remaining sections might find buyers. Wingwood House in Bar Harbor was the most expendable of the 3 estates. It was the newest, completed in 1927, and the least personally significant. Eva began exploring sale options, though buyers were scarce, but Whitemarsh was the largest problem. The house was unsellable at anything approaching its construction cost or even a reasonable fraction of that cost. It was too large, too expensive to maintain, and located in an area where no comparable estates existed. Who would buy it? For what purpose? Eva considered donating it to an institution, a school perhaps, a hospital, a museum. But institutions in the late 1930s were not accepting gifts that came with enormous maintenance obligations. The Depression had reduced endowments. Operating budgets were constrained. No one wanted a mansion that cost $1 million annually to maintain. So Whitemarsh sat empty. A monument to a lifestyle that had ended. A house built to last centuries that would be abandoned within 2 decades of completion. Eva's immediate problem was liquidity. She needed cash to live on and to operate El Mirasol while she sorted out the estates. The art collection represented her best option for generating funds quickly. But selling the Stotesbury collection would be humiliating. It would announce publicly that she was broke. Philadelphia society would know. New York society would know. Palm Beach society, where she was now living, would definitely know. Eva was trapped between financial necessity and social humiliation. She needed money. Getting money required selling assets. Selling assets would destroy the illusion that she was still wealthy, and maintaining that illusion was the only thing that allowed her to function in the social world where she had spent decades establishing herself. In the months following Edward's death, Eva Stotesbury learned that being rich and losing everything was worse than never having been rich at all. The fall was public. The humiliation was complete. And there was no one who would help her because everyone knew she and Edward had brought this on themselves. Edward Townsend Stotesbury had risen from 17-year-old clerk to partner of J.P. Morgan. He had accumulated $100 million through 7 decades of disciplined work, and he had destroyed it in 1 decade of refusal to acknowledge that the world had changed. His death ended the spending, but it left Eva to manage the consequences. A 73-year-old widow with 3 estates she could not afford, an art collection she could not sell at fair value, and a social position that was evaporating along with the money that had supported it. Whitemarsh Hall stood empty in Springfield Township. The 400-acre grounds began their slow transformation from manicured perfection to controlled wilderness. And Eva Stotesbury began the process of liquidating everything she and Edward had built. Eva's fire sale, 1938 to 1943. Eva tried to sell the Stotesbury art collection first, the English 18th century portraits that Edward had been collecting since before they married, paintings that had been compared favorably to the collections of Henry Clay Frick and Henry Edwards Huntington, works that should have commanded significant prices even in a depressed market. She received offers of approximately 10 cents on the dollar. 10 cents. For paintings that had cost hundreds of thousands to acquire. For a collection that had been assembled over decades with expert guidance from dealers like Joseph Duveen. The Depression had destroyed the art market along with everything else. Wealthy collectors were not buying. Museums had no acquisition budgets. The only buyers were speculators hoping to profit when markets eventually recovered. Eva refused to accept the lowball offers. She would rather donate the collection than sell it at such devastating losses. At least, donation would allow her to control the narrative. She could present it as philanthropy rather than desperation. She donated the art collection to museums. The paintings were dispersed to institutions that could provide proper care and display. Eva received tax deductions that were meaningless given her financial situation, but she received something more valuable, the appearance that she was making charitable gifts rather than conducting a fire sale. The furniture from Whitemarsh and the other estates presented similar problems. Georgian pieces purchased in England, French antiques acquired through Duveen, Persian rugs, marble statues, crystal chandeliers, all valuable in theory, all nearly worthless in the late 1930s when no one was furnishing mansions. Eva sold what she could at whatever prices buyers would pay. Auction houses handled some pieces. Private sales disposed of others. She realized pennies on the dollar but had no choice. She needed cash more than she needed furniture sitting in closed estates. The jewelry collection was more liquid. Eva had accumulated significant pieces during her years with Edward. Important diamonds. Historical pieces with provenance. Jewelry retained value better than furniture or art during the Depression because gems and precious metals had inherent worth beyond aesthetic appeal. She sold the majority of her jewelry collection in a series of private transactions. The proceeds provided operating funds for El Mirasol and covered her living expenses while she continued liquidating other assets. Selling the jewelry was painful. Each piece represented specific events or gifts, but it was necessary. Wingwood House in Bar Harbor was sold, though the exact price and timing are not well documented in available sources. The main estate had been the most recent acquisition and the least personally significant. Its sale was straightforward compared to the complications surrounding Whitemarsh. Parts of the Philadelphia townhouse were sold. The Philippatrian Club already owned portions purchased in 1925. Additional sections found buyers who could use the smaller spaces even if they could not afford or maintain the entire structure as the Stotesburys had operated it, but Whitemarsh remained unsold. The house sat empty through 1939, 1940, and 1941. Eva continued paying minimal maintenance to prevent total deterioration. A small staff kept the property secure. But the gardens were no longer maintained to previous standards. The fountains stopped flowing. The greenhouses were closed. The costs of maintaining even a closed Whitemarsh exceeded what Eva could afford long-term. Something had to change. In 1942, Eva made a dramatic gesture that received significant publicity. She donated Whitemarsh's perimeter fence to the War Department. The fence was extraordinary, 2 miles long, 8 feet tall, made of steel. It had been built to delineate the property boundaries and provide security. Now Eva donated it to be melted down for military use. The War Department calculated that the steel fence could be converted into metal for 18,000 guns. The donation was patriotic and practical. Eva needed to reduce the property's infrastructure costs. The fence was expensive to maintain and served no purpose for a closed estate. Removing it eliminated an ongoing expense while generating positive publicity during wartime. The donation allowed Eva to present herself as supporting the war effort rather than desperately cutting costs. The narrative shifted from broke widow liquidating assets to patriotic American contributing to national defense. The reality was both, but the patriotic framing was more dignified. Through 1942 and into 1943, Eva continued trying to sell Whitemarsh. She had listed the property with agents. She had contacted potential institutional buyers. She had explored every option. The answer was always the same. No one wanted it. Finally, in 1943, she found a buyer. The Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company, known as Pensalt, purchased Whitemarsh Hall for $167,000. $167,000 for a house that had cost $10 million to build 22 years earlier. The sale price was approximately 1.6% of construction costs. Pensalt was not buying Whitemarsh to live in. They were buying it to convert into a research and development facility. The company needed laboratory space away from urban areas. Whitemarsh's size and location made it suitable for conversion to industrial use. For Eva, the sale was simultaneously relief and humiliation. She finally had a buyer. But the price announced publicly that Whitemarsh was worthless as a residence. The mansion that was supposed to rival Versailles sold for less than what Edward and Eva had spent on furnishings alone. The proceeds from the Whitemarsh sale, combined with proceeds from selling other estates and their contents, plus the money from the jewelry sales, gave Eva enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Not at the level she and Edward had maintained, but comfortably by normal standards. She kept El Mirasol. The Palm Beach estate was manageable with a small staff and reasonable operating budget. It allowed her to maintain a presence in society, though her position was diminished from the heights of the 1920s. Eva lived at El Mirasol for the rest of her life. She died there on May 31st, 1946, at age 80. She was buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago, not in Philadelphia near Edward. The separation in death reflected something that had been true in life. They had been partners in ambition, not companions in affection. The liquidation of the Stotesbury estates took 8 years from Edward's death in 1938 to Eva's death in 1946. In that time, a fortune that had peaked at $100 million was completely dispersed. The art was in museums, the furniture was scattered, the jewelry was sold. 2 of the 3 major estates were gone, and Whitemarsh Hall, the crown jewel, had been sold to a chemical company for scrap value. Eva Stotesbury had married Edward to access wealth and position. She had achieved both. And she had outlived both, spending her final years managing the liquidation of everything they had built together. The fire sale was complete. Nothing remained except El Mirasol, which Eva held on to until her death, and Whitemarsh Hall, which was about to begin a new existence that would be even stranger than what the Stotesburys had created. 1943 to 1963, War in Laboratories. Pensalt Chemical Corporation took possession of Whitemarsh Hall in 1943 and immediately began converting it from residence to research facility. The ballroom where Eva had entertained hundreds became laboratory space. The bedrooms where guests had slept became offices. The dining room where 40 had dined formally became a cafeteria for researchers. But before Pensalt's conversion work was complete, Whitemarsh served an unexpected purpose that would connect it briefly to world history. During World War II, there was genuine fear that German U-boats or warships might bombard Manhattan. New York City housed some of America's most important cultural institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Met's collection was irreplaceable. If destroyed, centuries of art history would be lost. The Met needed a secure location to store their most valuable pieces away from potential attack. Whitemarsh Hall, recently purchased and sitting largely empty while Pensalt planned its conversion, was available. More importantly, it was remote from likely military targets while still being accessible from New York. The Met moved significant portions of their collection to Whitemarsh for storage during the war years. Paintings, sculpture, furniture, decorative arts. The mansion that had been built to display Edward Stotesbury's private art collection now protected America's public art treasures. The irony was profound. Whitemarsh had been built as a monument to private wealth and exclusivity. During its finest moment of service to the nation, It functioned as a warehouse protecting public property from fascist destruction. The mansion's purpose had inverted completely. The Met's tenure at Whitemarsh was temporary. When the war ended and the threat of attack on Manhattan disappeared, the art was returned to New York. Whitemarsh reverted to Pensalt's control for the industrial conversion that had been interrupted by wartime emergency. Pensalt's transformation of Whitemarsh into laboratories was extensive but practical. The company needed research space for developing chemical processes and products. The mansion's large rooms could accommodate equipment. The underground floors provided secure storage for materials. The property's isolation was advantageous for work that might involve hazardous substances. The ballroom's medieval tapestries were removed. The crystal chandeliers were taken down. The Carrara marble fireplaces remained, but were made functional for heating rather than display. The organ that had risen 3 stories was dismantled. The building was systematically stripped of residential features and rebuilt for industrial use. The grounds were no longer maintained as formal gardens. Pensalt needed parking for employees and outdoor storage for equipment. The French-style gardens that 70 gardeners had maintained were allowed to naturalize. Some plantings survived. Most died or were removed. The fountains stopped flowing permanently. The Belvedere remained but was no longer maintained. Pensalt operated their research facility at Whitemarsh for 20 years. The company's scientists worked in spaces where the Stotesburys had entertained. They developed chemical processes in rooms where Eva had displayed jewelry. The building functioned efficiently for its new purpose, proving that Horace Trumbauer's design was sound even when used for purposes he had never imagined. But in 1963, Pensalt built a new research center in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. The new facility was modern, purpose-built for laboratory work, and more convenient for the company's operations. The Whitemarsh facility was outdated by comparison. Pensalt moved out of Whitemarsh and sold the property to a real estate investment group. The sale price is not well documented, but it was presumably modest given the building's age and the limited market for former mansions converted to laboratories. The investment group purchased Whitemarsh with the intention of selling it to someone who could use it productively. They explored various options. Could it be a school? A hospital? A corporate headquarters? An institutional use that would justify the building's size and provide income to cover maintenance? No viable buyer emerged. Schools did not need buildings this large. Hospitals required purpose-built facilities with modern systems. Corporations were moving to suburban office parks, not converted mansions. Every potential use was examined and rejected as impractical or too expensive. The property sat empty after Pensalt vacated. The investment group paid minimal maintenance while searching for buyers, but minimal maintenance on a structure the size of Whitemarsh was insufficient. Buildings deteriorate quickly when unoccupied. Windows broke. Whether from weather, accident, or vandalism was irrelevant. Broken windows allowed rain inside. Water damaged floors and walls. Plaster cracked. Wood rotted. The process of decay began slowly, but accelerated as damage allowed more damage. Vandals discovered the empty mansion. By the mid-1960s, Whitemarsh was known locally as an abandoned building where teenagers could explore without oversight. They broke in through damaged windows and unlocked doors. They explored rooms where millionaires had lived and scientists had worked. The vandalism was not immediately destructive. Early visitors were curious explorers more than deliberate destroyers. But each visitor caused some damage. Graffiti appeared on walls. Fixtures were removed as souvenirs. The accumulated effect of hundreds of visitors was progressive destruction. Thieves followed vandals. Anything portable was stolen. Copper pipes and wiring were removed for scrap value. Marble fixtures that could be pried loose were taken. The bronze hardware that Trumbauer had specified for every door disappeared. Light fixtures were ripped from ceilings. The systematic theft continued for years. The property changed hands multiple times between 1963 and 1977 as successive owners failed to find viable uses or buyers. Each owner paid minimal maintenance while exploring options. None were willing to invest in restoration without assurance they could recover costs through sale or productive use. Springfield Township officials watched Whitemarsh deteriorate with increasing concern. The building was becoming a hazard. Unsupervised teenagers exploring a damaged structure created liability. Drug dealers reportedly used the property for transactions. The mansion that had been Springfield Township's most prestigious structure was now an embarrassment and a problem. Various institutional uses were proposed and studied. The Springfield Township Planning Commission evaluated converting Whitemarsh to a community center, a municipal building, a library. Every proposal was abandoned as financially unfeasible. The restoration costs were prohibitive. The ongoing maintenance would strain township budgets. No public use justified the expense. By the mid-1970s, Whitemarsh Hall was a ruin. Not romantic ruin like European castles. Squalid ruin. Graffiti covered every interior surface. Rubble filled the floors. Every portable element had been stolen. Windows were broken throughout. The roof leaked. The structure was deteriorating beyond the point where restoration was practical. The building that had been designed to stand for centuries was failing after 50 years. Not because Trumbauer's engineering was faulty, because no one valued it enough to maintain it. Because the world that had created Whitemarsh no longer existed, and the people who inherited that world had no use for its monuments. In 1977, zoning regulations were changed to allow residential development on the Whitemarsh property. The change made demolition profitable. If the land could be subdivided and sold for townhouses, there was finally a viable economic use for the property. Demolition became inevitable. The question was no longer whether Whitemarsh Hall would be destroyed, but when. 1977 to 1980, demolition. In 1978, developer Jay Gross purchased the ruined Whitemarsh Hall property. Gross did not buy it to restore. He bought it to demolish and replace with housing that people would actually purchase and maintain. The Springfield Township Planning Commission had approved zoning changes that allowed construction of 163 townhouses and single-family dwellings on the Whitemarsh grounds. The math was straightforward. Land value for residential development exceeded any possible value of preserving a vandalized mansion that no one wanted. Preservationists attempted to stop the demolition. The Springfield Township Historical Society, which would be founded in 1985, partly in response to Whitemarsh's destruction, did not yet exist to lead organized opposition. Other groups tried to generate public pressure to save the building. Their arguments were rational. Whitemarsh Hall was historically significant. It represented important American architecture. Horace Trumbauer's design deserved preservation. The mansion had housed the Met's collection during World War II. It was part of national history, not just local history. But rational arguments failed against economic reality. Who would pay for restoration? Estimates suggested millions of dollars would be required to repair damage from 15 years of vandalism and neglect. Who would maintain it after restoration? The annual operating costs had bankrupted the Stotesburys. No institution or individual was offering to take on that burden. The preservationists could not answer these questions. They wanted Whitemarsh saved, but had no plan for how to save it or what to do with it afterward. Emotional appeals to preserve architectural heritage meant nothing when no one would commit money or infrastructure to accomplish preservation. Jay Gross and Springfield Township proceeded with demolition plans. Disputes about the form of development, particularly proposals for high-rise apartment buildings that neighbors opposed, delayed execution for several years. But the decision to demolish was final. In the spring of 1980, wrecking crews arrived at Whitemarsh Hall. They wore T-shirts that said Stotesbury Mansion on the back. Someone had decided to commemorate the destruction with souvenir apparel. The irony was not subtle. The demolition process was methodical. The building was too large to simply knock down with wrecking balls. It had to be dismantled carefully to avoid damage to portions that would remain and to control debris. The limestone facade came down in sections. The blocks that had been cut to precise specifications and assembled with invisible joints in 1916 were broken apart and hauled away as rubble. Some blocks were saved by collectors who wanted pieces of Whitemarsh, but most were crushed for fill. The interior was stripped before structural demolition. Anything remaining that had value was removed and sold. The marble that had not already been stolen was extracted carefully for reuse. The solid wood doors that had not been taken by thieves were removed. Even damaged plaster and woodwork was evaluated for salvage value. The underground floors were filled in. The 3 levels that Trumbauer had designed to maintain proper proportions while providing service space were buried under rubble and dirt. The refrigeration plant, the kitchens, the wine cellars, the mechanical systems, all were entombed. The steel frame that had been over-engineered to support the building for centuries was cut apart with torches. The metal was sold for scrap. The foundations were broken up and removed where they interfered with new construction. Where they did not interfere, they were simply buried. The organ that had risen 3 stories and filled the mansion with music during Eva's parties had been removed years earlier when Pensalt converted the building. Its ultimate fate is not documented in available sources. The ballroom where hundreds had danced was demolished and hauled away as tons of broken marble and splintered wood. The demolition took weeks. Crews worked through spring and into summer. Piece by piece, Whitemarsh Hall disappeared. The limestone, the marble, the plasterwork, the hardwood floors, the crystal chandelier mounting points, the doorways that Trumbauer had positioned for perfect proportions, all reduced to rubble. Local residents who had opposed demolition watched it proceed with mixture of anger and resignation. Newspaper articles documented the process. Photographers captured the progressive destruction. The coverage emphasized what was being lost but could not stop it from being lost. By late summer 1980, Whitemarsh Hall was gone. 59 years after completion, the 3rd largest private residence in American history had been deliberately destroyed. Not damaged by disaster, not ruined by war, demolished because it was economically worthless. 4 elements were left standing deliberately. The 4 massive Ionic columns that had supported the front portico. 50 feet tall, Indiana limestone. They were too large to remove economically and too impressive to destroy without reason. J. Gross decided to incorporate them into the new development as ruins. Instant history for a suburban housing complex. The belvedere at the rear of where the mansion had stood was also preserved. The structure was separate from the main building and in better condition than the house itself. It could be maintained without enormous expense and provided the development with an architectural focal point. Some of the garden walls survived. Limestone walls that had defined spaces in the formal gardens. They were structurally sound and visually attractive. The development incorporated them as design elements that suggested the property's history without requiring restoration or maintenance. A small stone gatehouse remained intact near the entrance to what had been the estate. The building was solid, functional, and could be adapted for use by the development's management, or sold as a small residence. Everything else was gone. The 147 rooms, the 64-foot ballroom, the 3-story organ, the 28 bathrooms with bronze dolphin faucets, the movie theater, the gymnasium, the refrigeration plant, the underground levels, the French formal gardens, the fountains, the greenhouses, the infrastructure for 70 gardeners and 40 household staff. Construction of Stotesbury Estates began immediately on the cleared land. Townhouses and single-family homes rose where the mansion had stood. Modern suburban housing for middle-class families. The irony was complete. Land that Edward Stotesbury purchased to build a monument to wealth now housed developments named after him that he would have considered unworthy of notice. The 4 Ionic columns stood in the middle of the development, surrounded by lawns and townhouses. Visitors who did not know the history might wonder what they were. Decorative follies, architectural pretension. The columns looked absurd without context, fragments of a destroyed temple in a suburban housing development. But to those who knew Whitemarsh's history, the columns were something else. They were evidence. Proof that something extraordinary had existed here. The last remaining elements of the 3rd largest private residence America ever built. Whitemarsh Hall had lasted from 1921 to 1980. 59 years. Biltmore, built in the 1890s, still stands today as a museum. Oheka Castle, built in the 19-teens, was restored and operates as a hotel and event venue. Other great Gilded Age estates have been preserved by institutions, governments, or private owners who valued them enough to pay for their survival. Whitemarsh Hall was demolished because no one valued it sufficiently. The mansion that Edward and Eva Stotesbury built to announce their significance became evidence of something they could not have imagined. That significance is temporary, that fortunes disappear, and that buildings designed to last forever can be destroyed in a summer when no one considers them worth saving. The largest deliberate demolition of a private residence in American history happened in 1980. Most Americans did not notice. Whitemarsh Hall had been closed since 1938. It had been a chemical laboratory for 20 years. It had been a ruin for another 15. By the time wrecking crews arrived, few people remembered what it had been. Edward Townsend Stotesbury had risen from 17-year-old clerk sweeping floors at Drexel and Company to senior partner alongside J.P. Morgan. He accumulated $100 million through 7 decades of disciplined work. He built Whitemarsh Hall to announce that his success was permanent. The mansion was designed to stand for centuries. It stood for 59 years. Eva Stotesbury married Edward to access wealth and position. She achieved both. She spent 10 years building their social empire and another decade watching it collapse. She died at El Mirasol in Palm Beach, the only estate she managed to keep. She was buried in Chicago, far from Edward and far from Whitemarsh. The mansion they built together cost $10 million. It was sold in 1943 for $167,000. It was demolished in 1980 because no one would pay to preserve it. 4 limestone columns remain today in Stotesbury Estates, a development of townhouses and single-family homes built on land where the mansion stood. The columns are 50 feet tall and absurdly out of scale with their surroundings. They look like stage props that survived after the theater burned down. The Belvedere remains. Garden walls remain. A small gatehouse remains. These fragments suggest that something significant existed here, but they cannot communicate what that something was. You cannot understand Whitemarsh Hall from 4 columns and a belvedere. The mansion is documented extensively in photographs, architectural drawings, and written accounts. We know what it looked like. We know how it functioned. We know what it cost and what it represented. But documentation is not preservation. No one can walk through Whitemarsh's ballroom today. No one can stand in the entrance hall and understand the scale. No one can experience what the Stotesburys created. The Springfield Township Historical Society was founded in 1985, partly in response to Whitemarsh's destruction and the township's failure to preserve other historic structures. The society collects documentation and advocates for preservation of remaining historic buildings. Their existence is an acknowledgement that letting Whitemarsh be destroyed was a mistake. But acknowledgement does not restore what was lost. Whitemarsh Hall's destruction raises uncomfortable questions about preservation and value. Should the mansion have been saved? If so, by whom and for what purpose? Who would have paid the millions required for restoration? Who would have covered annual operating costs that bankrupted one of America's wealthiest men? These questions have no satisfying answers. Whitemarsh was historically significant and architecturally important. It was also ruinously expensive to maintain and served no practical purpose in a world that had moved beyond Gilded Age excess. Both things were true. The contradiction could not be resolved, so the building was demolished. The loss is permanent. Biltmore and Oheka Castle survive because they found institutional purposes or wealthy owners who valued them beyond their market price. Whitemarsh found neither. It survived long enough to become a ruin, and then it was destroyed because ruined mansions are worthless. Edward Stotesbury built Whitemarsh to prove his significance. Instead, it proved that significance is temporary. Eva Stotesbury used Whitemarsh to dominate society. Instead, it became evidence that social position evaporates when money disappears. Horace Trumbauer designed Whitemarsh to stand for centuries. Instead, it was demolished after 59 years. The 4 columns stand in Stotesbury Estates as inadvertent monuments to impermanence. They announce that something was here. They cannot explain what that something meant or why it could not survive. Whitemarsh Hall is gone. The largest American house ever deliberately demolished will never be rebuilt. The photographs and documentation will fade. Eventually, even the memory of what stood here will disappear. The columns will remain, fragments without context, until they too are removed when maintenance becomes expensive and no one remembers why they were preserved. This is what remains of $10 million and 10 years of ambition. 4 limestone columns in a suburban development surrounded by townhouses where families live who have never heard of Edward and Eva Stotesbury or the mansion that made them briefly significant and permanently forgotten.